It was the entrance to an ancient underground dungeon, a place the entire village feared and avoided. The air inside was heavy, smelling of damp earth and centuries of oblivion. But, to their surprise, a current of warm air emanated from its depths. With trembling hands but an unshakable spirit, Ilara and the boys began to clear the place, sweeping away cobwebs and loose stones. With each piece of moss removed, each makeshift fire they lit, the dungeon, once terrifying, revealed a natural warmth and an unexpected dryness, promising more than a simple refuge from the approaching storm. Outside, the cold tightened its grip, and the villagers' mockery seemed to dissipate into the icy air, while the small family, in their new and improbable home, began to unravel the secrets the stones held. With each cautious step, the dungeon's darkness seemed to recede, not out of fear, but from a silent invitation. Ilara, with the boys huddled beside her, felt the warm air intensify, a vital breath that pushed away the biting cold that was announcing itself outside. The makeshift torches, fashioned from dry branches and resin, danced, casting ghostly shadows on the damp walls, but the warmth emanating from the depths was more constant, more comforting than any flame. They advanced through a narrow corridor, where the smell of damp earth began to mix with a subtle, almost imperceptible aroma of ancient stone, and something more, something clean, ethereal. The cobwebs, once dense and sticky, became sparser, as if an invisible force had swept them away. The boys, initially apprehensive, now looked around with a mix of curiosity and wonder, their small hearts beating faster, not from fear, but from contained excitement. "Grandma, what's that?" whispered the youngest, pointing to a wall that, under the flickering light, revealed carvings. They were not the rough marks of a prison, but delicate symbols, spirals and geometric shapes that seemed to tell a forgotten story. Ilara touched the cold stone, feeling the unexpected smoothness of the polished surface, a stark contrast to the raw rock she had expected. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, but still it was not what one would expect from a dungeon. The ceiling was high, vaulted, and the floor, though covered by a thin layer of dust and millennia of debris, appeared to be made of perfectly fitted flagstones. In the center, a circular structure rose like a dry well from which the flow of warm air was strongest, almost an embrace. "It's not a dungeon, my little ones," Ilara murmured, her voice choked with discovery. It's something else." As they approached the well, a faint, greenish glow began to emanate from the depths, a bioluminescent light that painted the walls with an ethereal hue. It wasn't strong enough to illuminate the entire chamber, but it was enough to reveal more details. The walls were adorned with faded frescoes, scenes of an ancient people, gods and mythical creatures, all bathed in the soft, greenish light. The warm air was not just air. It was a gentle breeze, carrying a scent Ilara couldn't identify, but one that soothed the soul. It was as if the stone itself breathed. The tension of exile, the cold of the mountain, the humiliation from the villagers, all began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of profound peace and an almost childlike wonder. Outside, the mountain groaned. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, whipping snow and ice against the rocks. The sound of the storm, once an imminent threat, now served only to highlight the contrast with the newly discovered sanctuary. The violent gusts echoed like distant drums, but inside the chamber the sound was muffled, distant, almost unreal. Ilara realized the circular well was not a well, but an opening to something much deeper. The greenish light came from there, and the heat was so intense she felt her fingertips tingle. It was geothermal heat, yes, but there was something more. An energy, a presence. With renewed courage, she knelt, brushing away the dust from the floor near the opening. Beneath the grime, she found an inscription carved in a language she didn't know. yet it felt familiar to her spirit. The symbols glowed faintly with the greenish light, as if alive. "Here life finds refuge," she whispered, translating the words in her mind, though she knew not how. It was an intuition, an ancient voice speaking through the stones. The boys, fascinated, sat near her, their eyes fixed on the light in the walls. Fear had completely vanished, replaced by boundless curiosity. They were no longer in a terrifying dungeon, but in a magical place, a fairy tale come true. Elara knew the storm outside would be the fiercest the mountain had seen in decades. She could feel it in the air pressure, in the distant vibration of the wind. But here, within this forgotten sanctuary, they were safe. More than safe, they were protected, warm, blessed. The villagers' mockery, the guards' cruel words, all seemed insignificant now. They had been cast out into darkness, but they had found the light. And this light, she felt, was only the beginning. Night fell heavily upon the mountains, and the storm reached its peak. Outside, the world was a white, icy chaos, a fury of nature that showed no mercy. But inside the sanctuary, Elara and the boys huddled near the opening that radiated warmth and light, feeling safer and more at home than they ever had in the village. The stones held secrets, yes, but they also held promises. And the sweetest promise of all was that of a new beginning, in a place where kindness and resilience were the true currency. The storm, she knew, would bring not only cold, but also the truth. The storm, she knew, would bring not only cold, but also the truth. And outside, on the wind-swept slopes, that truth began to manifest with relentless fury. As Elara and the boys huddled in the warm, luminous chamber, the outside world became a white hell, a vortex of ice and biting winds that transformed the familiar landscape into an unrecognizable nightmare. The guards, those same men who had mocked Elara and pushed her into exile, now fought for their own lives. They had been sent to patrol the lower passes, a routine task that, on the coldest night of the year, had become a death sentence. Captain Theron, a robust, square-jawed man whose arrogance was as dense as the snow that now blinded him, led the small group. Beside him, young guards Kyle and Borin, whose sneering smiles still echoed in Elara's memory, now trembled not only from cold, but from a primal fear that chilled them to the bone. The wind howled like 1,000 hungry demons, tearing loose stones from the slopes and whipping them against their exposed faces. Snow fell in spirals, dense and blinding, reducing visibility to mere steps. Torches, which once offered a comforting light, now barely resisted the element's fury, their flames dancing desperately before being swallowed by the icy darkness. Each step was a battle, each breath an ice dagger in their lungs. "Captain, I can't see anything," Kyle shouted, his voice almost inaudible against the wind's roar. He stumbled over an invisible rock, falling to his knees in the deep snow. The cold penetrated his thick clothes, turning them into armor of ice. Theron, who until then had maintained an unshakable facade of bravery, felt despair gnawing at his insides. The path back to the village had vanished. The trails they knew like the back of their hand were now covered by a treacherous layer of snow and ice. They were lost, completely lost. The mockery they had directed at Elara, the certainty of their own superiority, now seemed a cruel joke from the mountain. "Keep going! We can't stop!" Theron roared, but his voice lacked its former conviction. The cold was numbing his fingers, and he could feel the tips of his nose and ears burning with the excruciating pain of frostbite. An icy doubt, sharper than the wind, began to infiltrate his mind. What if they didn't find their way back? The village, so safe and warm in their minds, now seemed a distant, unattainable dream. Borin, the youngest of the guards, began to whimper, his lips blue and cracked. He remembered old Elara, her kind eyes, even as he and Kale pushed her out of the gates. He remembered her last words, a whisper about the mountain holding its own secrets. At the time, he had laughed. Now that laughter seemed a distant echo of a life he might never see again. Inside the sanctuary, the greenish light from the well pulsed softly, a living heart beating in the earth's depths. Ilara felt a pang, a vibration in the air that was not from the wind but from something more, a premonition. She knew the storm was not just a storm, it was a test, a purification. And outside, those who had condemned her were failing miserably. The boys, oblivious to the drama outside, played with the dancing shadows on the walls, their faces illuminated by the ethereal light. The heat emanating from the well was so intense that they had shed their heavy cloaks, feeling comfortable in their light tunics. The mysterious perfume of the sanctuary filled the air, calming their small hearts. But Ilara's mind was far away. She could almost feel the guards' despair, the penetrating cold that enveloped them. The mountain, which had welcomed her, was now showing its cruelest face to those who had disrespected its children. It was a wild, relentless justice. Suddenly a sharp cry tore through the air, muffled by distance, but unmistakable. It was a cry of pain, of despair. Theron and Kale had lost Borin. The young guard, exhausted and disoriented, had slipped on a treacherous patch of ice, falling into a crevice hidden by the snow. His cries grew weaker, muffled by the wind and distance. "Borin! Borin!" Theron shouted, trying to approach the crevice, but the ground was slippery and dangerous. Kyle, paralyzed by terror, watched the captain fight against the wind, his eyes wide with horror. They were alone, lost, and now one of them was dying. Arrogance crumbled, revealing the rawness of reality. There was no more mockery, only cold, paralyzing fear. The mountain did not forgive, and the truth of their own insignificance before nature, was revealing itself brutally and undeniably. Ilara, in the sanctuary, felt a shiver, an urgency that propelled her. The guard's fate, she knew, was now in her hands. That cry, muffled by the mountain's fury, resonated deeper in Ilara's soul than any word of scorn ever uttered. It was not just a sound of pain, but an echo of human despair, a primal call that transcended the memory of past injuries. The warmth of the sanctuary, which once enveloped her in peace, now seemed an unsustainable luxury in the face of the imminent tragedy outside. The intuition that had guided her to that refuge now propelled her out of it, into the heart of the storm. The boys, their faces still illuminated by the greenish light, looked up at Ilara, sensing the change in her expression. The smile she had given them moments before vanished, replaced by an expression of grave determination. She stood, age weighing on her bones, but her will unshakable. "My little ones," she said, her voice a firm whisper that cut through the perfumed air of the sanctuary. "There are men out there, lost, injured. I cannot leave them." The eyes of one of the boys, the eldest, widened. "But Ilara, Captain Theron, they cast us out." Ilara touched the boy's face with a wrinkled but gentle hand. "The mountain doesn't care for the justice of men, my dear. The mountain cares for life, and so do I." She knew it was madness. To leave the warm embrace of that sacred place for the white hell outside was an act of blind faith or pure stubbornness. But the image of Borin, the young guard with the pale, frightened face, falling into the crevice, would not leave her. She had seen the fear in his eyes, and fear, she knew, was a colder chill than any wind. She donned her heavy wool clothes, her hood pulled up to cover her face. The contrast between the sanctuary's warmth and what awaited her was almost palpable, an invisible barrier of temperature she would have to break. The boys huddled, watching her with a mixture of awe and terror. "Stay here," she instructed, pointing to the well opening that radiated warmth. "Don't leave for anything. The sanctuary will protect you." With a last look at the boys' worried faces, Ilara turned to the cave entrance. Each step outward was a battle against the warm air's resistance, a sacrifice. The moment the perfumed breeze was replaced by the icy, cutting gust was a brutal shock. The wind howled like a million lost souls, and the snow, once just a distant spectacle, now lashed her face like 1,000 ice needles. The darkness was almost total, broken only by pale lightning flashes that momentarily revealed the fury of the white chaos. Ilara squinted, her vision blurred by the snow and the tears the wind tore from her eyes. The path she had taken to find the sanctuary was completely unrecognizable, covered by mountains of snow and ice. But she was not alone. The sanctuary's energy, which she had felt pulsing within her, seemed to extend outward, a thin line of warmth and direction. It was as if the mountain itself guided her, whispering secrets through the wind's roar. She clung to this feeling, this intuition, and began to advance, one step at a time, against the relentless force of the storm. With each meter, the cold deepened, penetrating her clothes, numbing her limbs. Her lungs burned with the icy air, and with each breath it felt as if ice crystals formed in her chest. But Ilara did not stop. The image of Borin, the cry of despair, propelled her. She stumbled on hidden rocks, slipped on treacherous ice patches, but always picked herself up, determination etched on her aged face. She was a woman of the mountain, accustomed to life's harshness, and the mountain, though now furious, was also her home. Suddenly, through the snow mist, a dark shadow materialized, then another, and then a sound. Not the wind's howl, but a human moan, weak and desperate. She was close. Dragging herself the last few meters, Ilara saw. Theron and Kale were huddled against a rocky outcrop, their bodies covered in snow, their faces blue and frozen. Their torches had long since extinguished, and the darkness was almost absolute, save for occasional flashes of lightning. Kyle was trembling uncontrollably, his teeth chattering. Theron, the once imposing captain, was hunched over, his eyes fixed on a dark crevice in the snow, from which the wind carried a terrifying silence. The scent of fear was almost palpable in the icy air. Ilara approached, her ghostly figure emerging from the white fury. The wind whipped her hood, revealing her wrinkled face, but her eyes, though tired, shone with a strange, almost supernatural light. Kale was the first to see her. His eyes wide, he let out a muffled scream, a mixture of terror and disbelief. "The old woman! It's the old woman!" Theron raised his head, his eyes bloodshot and almost frozen. He blinked, trying to process the unreal image before him. Ilara, the woman he had cast out, the woman he had mocked. She was there, in the midst of the most brutal storm he had ever seen, looking strangely intact, almost serene. "Ilara," Theron managed to murmur, his voice hoarse and weak, almost inaudible against the wind's roar. The arrogance he wore like armor had shattered, revealing a broken man on the brink of despair. Shame began to burn in his chest, a heat more painful than the cold consuming him. Ilara wasted no time with recriminations. "Where is the boy?" she asked, her voice surprisingly clear and firm, cutting through the wind's cacophony. She pointed to the crevice. "Borin?" Theron merely nodded, unable to speak, his eyes filled with frozen tears. The mountain did not forgive, and the truth of their own insignificance before nature, was revealing itself brutally and undeniably. But there before them was the woman they had scorned, and she was the only hope they had left. The mountain howled, a melody of fury and despair that swallowed any sound of hope. Ilara's question, "Where is the boy?" cut through the icy air with an impossible clarity. There was no anger in her voice, only a cold, unshakable urgency. Theron, his lips blue and body trembling, barely managed to point to the crevice, a dark and treacherous abyss that opened in the snow, swallowing light and life. The silence emanating from it was more terrifying than any scream. Kyle, still in shock, stumbled back, his eyes fixed on Ilara's wrinkled figure. She was an apparition, a mirage of a past they had tried to erase. Shame, once just an uncomfortable ember, now exploded into a burning fire in his chest, searing through the paralyzing cold. How could she be there? How could she be so whole when they, young and strong, were on the brink of death? Ilara didn't wait for answers. Her eyes, accustomed to darkness and nature's fury, peered into the crevice. The wind whipped snow into the abyss, making it impossible to see the bottom. But she felt the presence of young Borin, weak but still alive, a tenuous thread of life fighting against death's icy embrace. The sanctuary's energy, which had guided her there, now pulsed stronger, an internal compass pointing towards life. She knelt at the edge, ignoring the danger and the slippery ice. Theron and Kale, despite their deplorable state, tried to stop her. "No, Ilara, it's too dangerous," Theron managed to stammer, extending a trembling hand. But she was already acting. With surprising agility for her age, Ilara began to feel around the snow near the crevice. She wasn't looking for a rope nor a branch. She was looking for something deeper, something only the mountain's ancients knew. Her wrinkled fingers, despite the cold, seemed to possess a keen sensitivity, gliding over rock and ice. "We need an anchor," she said, her voice almost inaudible against the wind's roar, but laden with authority. "Something firm. The mountain always provides." Kyle, still paralyzed, watched. Theron, however, felt a flicker of hope, a spark that ignited in his frozen heart. The old woman, whom they had scorned, was the only one who seemed to know what to do. The humiliation was immense, but the will to survive was greater. Ilara suddenly stopped. Her fingers found an indentation in the rock, a natural fissure, almost invisible beneath the layer of ice. She began to scrape away the snow and ice with her bare hands, revealing a rocky protrusion, solid and unyielding. "Here," she murmured, "the mountain gives us its strength." But how to descend? They had no ropes. Theron's mind, though numb, desperately tried to find a solution. He looked at his own clothes, at the heavy cloaks they wore. Ilara, as if reading his thoughts, looked at them. "Your cloaks. We need your cloaks. And your belts." Theron and Kyle hesitated for an instant. Their cloaks were their only protection against the storm's fury. Taking off their cloaks meant exposing themselves further to the deadly cold. But Borin's life was at stake, and Ilara's voice brooked no argument. It was the voice of the mountain, relentless and wise. With trembling, numb fingers, they began to untie their cloaks. The wind immediately penetrated their thinner clothes, making them shiver uncontrollably. The pain was excruciating, but the shame of their own weakness and guilt over Borin propelled them. They handed the cloaks to Ilara, who examined them with a practical gaze. "Tie them," she instructed, pointing to the rocky protrusion she had discovered. "Strong. Each knot must be an oath to life." Theron, with difficulty, began to tie the cloaks, using the belts to reinforce the joins. His fingers were so frozen he could barely feel the knots, but he forced himself to continue, the image of Borin's frightened face etched in his mind. Kyle, seeing the captain act, also joined in, his mind still in a fog of terror, but his survival instincts beginning to surface. As they worked, Ilara leaned over the crevice again, calling, "Borin, can you hear me, boy? It's Ilara. Hold on!" A weak, almost imperceptible moan rose from the abyss. It was Borin's voice, a thread of hope amidst despair. He was alive. "He's alive!" Theron shouted, a wave of relief and mixed panic. "But how are we going to get him out?" The makeshift rope of cloaks and belts was ready, swaying precariously over the crevice. It was long enough, but it seemed fragile against the immensity of the abyss. Ilara turned to Theron and Kale, her eyes meeting theirs. "One of you will have to go down. The lightest one." The two guards exchanged glances. Kyle was the youngest and slimmest. The terror in his eyes was palpable. I can't, Ilara. I can't see anything down there." "You don't need to see," Ilara replied, her voice calm and firm. "You need to feel. The mountain will guide you, and I will guide you from above." She looked at Theron. "You, Captain, will hold the rope. Your life and Borin's life depend on your strength." The responsibility weighed on Theron like an avalanche. He, the captain who had mocked the old woman, now depended on her for everything. Shame was a poison spreading through his veins, but the need to save Borin, to redeem himself, was a powerful antidote. He nodded, his teeth clenched, determination etched on his frozen face. Kyle, seeing the resolve in Ilara's eyes and Theron's acceptance, swallowed hard. He was a guard, trained for danger, but nothing had prepared him for this. With a lump in his throat, he approached the makeshift rope. "Don't be afraid, boy," Ilara said, touching his shoulder. "The mountain won't let you fall if you respect it, and Borin needs you." With a last look at Theron, who was already firmly gripping the rope, Kyle began to descend, one step at a time, into the dark, icy abyss. With each meter he descended, the wind seemed to lessen, but the cold intensified, and darkness swallowed the little light the storm allowed. Ilara, kneeling at the edge, guided him with calm, precise words, her eyes fixed on the crevice, as if she could see through the darkness. Borin's life and the guard's redemption hung on the tenuous thread of that makeshift rope. Kyle descended into the abyss, not with the bravery of a trained guard, but with the hesitation of a man confronting his own terror. The makeshift rope of cloaks and belts swayed precariously, and with each meter he moved away from the storm's dying light. The darkness grew denser, more oppressive. The wind, which howled like a hungry wolf above, here inside the crevice, diminished to an icy whisper, but the cold. The cold was a living entity, penetrating his bones, stealing his warmth and hope. His already numb fingers fumbled at the damp, slippery rock, seeking any handhold. With each movement, a shiver ran through his body, not just from the cold, but from the fear of slipping, of falling into the unfathomable void. He swallowed hard, trying to control his ragged breath that fogged the air before his eyes. From above, Ilara's voice was a thread of light in the darkness, surprisingly clear and calm, cutting through the abyss's heavy silence. "More to the right, boy. Feel the rock. There's a ledge there. Use your left foot to steady yourself." Kyle obeyed blindly, his muscles tense. His mind focused only on her instructions. It was as if the old woman could see through the darkness, as if the mountain spoke through her. Above, Theron fought against the storm's fury and the excruciating pain in his hands. The rope, wet and frozen, cut into his skin, but he refused to let go. Every fiber of his being was focused on keeping Kale and, by extension, Borin, safe. His teeth were clenched, a mixture of physical pain and moral shame. He, the captain, the strong and proud man, was reduced to a link in the chain of salvation, a link that depended entirely on the wisdom of the woman he had scorned. The image of Ilara, serene and unshakable, contrasted brutally with his own weakness and despair. Humiliation was a fire burning in his chest, more intense than the cold that consumed him. Kyle continued his descent, meter by meter, darkness swallowing him. He called Borin's name, his voice weak and trembling, echoing in the void. "Borin, can you hear me? It's Kale." Silence was the only answer, a silence that threatened to crush his last hope. But Ilara persisted. "He's there, boy. Feel it. Life has a sound, even in silence." Suddenly, Kale felt something. Not a sight, but a presence. A different shiver, a sensation of faint warmth, almost imperceptible amidst the cold. He stretched out his hand, desperately fumbling in the darkness. His fingers brushed against something soft, then cold and damp. It was fabric. He followed the fabric, and then he felt cold skin, a face. "Borin!" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The boy was huddled in a small, almost invisible recess, his body covered in snow and ice, his lips blue, his eyes half closed. He was alive, but barely. A faint moan escaped his lips, a sound of pain and exhaustion. "He's here! I found him!" Kyle shouted, his voice echoing through the crevice, laden with relief and renewed panic. "Thank the heavens!" Theron murmured from above, a sigh of relief escaping his cracked lips. Hope, once a small pinpoint of light, now shone a little brighter. "Now, Kale, listen carefully." Ilara's voice came again, firm and urgent. "You need to tie him. Use your belt, anything. Secure him to the rope. Don't let him slip." Kale, with his fingers almost frozen, began to unbuckle his own belt. The task was agonizing in the darkness and cold. He tried to keep Borin awake, talking to him, touching his face. "Hold on, Borin. We're here. We'll get you out." Borin, with immense effort, managed to open his eyes for an instant, a flicker of recognition and fear in his gaze. He was on the verge of collapse, but Kyle's voice and the presence of a familiar face, even in the darkness, seemed to give him a last spark of strength. With difficulty, Kale managed to tie Borin to the makeshift rope, securing him firmly to his own body. It was a clumsy tie, but it seemed secure enough. "Ready, Ilara, he's tied." "Excellent, boy. Now the ascent will be slow. Theron, pull gently. Kyle, use your feet to push off the rock. One step at a time. Don't rush. The mountain has its own rhythm." The ascent began. Theron, with superhuman effort, began to pull the rope. Every inch was a battle. His muscles screamed in protest. His shoulders burned, but he refused to yield. Borin's life and the redemption of his own soul depended on his strength. He looked at Ilara's ghostly figure, who remained kneeling at the edge, her eyes fixed on the crevice, an unshakable sentinel. She showed no signs of tiredness, cold, or fear. She was the mountain. Kyle, with Borin tied to him, felt the boy's weight, but also the urgency to get him out. He pushed with his feet, seeking support on the small ledges, while Theron pulled from above. Progress was glacial, exhausting. With each movement, the cold seemed to drain more of his energy, and darkness seemed to mock their efforts. Borin, semi-conscious, occasionally moaned, a sound that pierced Kale's heart. He tried to comfort the boy, whispering words of encouragement even as his own body trembled uncontrollably. Above, the storm continued to howl, but for Theron the most important sound was Ilara's voice guiding them. "A little more, Theron. Keep steady. Kyle, feel for the next ledge, to your left, almost there." With each meter they ascended, the storm's faint light seemed a little closer, a beacon of hope. Theron and Kale's shame was a weight almost as great as the boys', but gratitude for Ilara, the woman they had abandoned, began to blossom in their frozen hearts, a strange and unexpected warmth amidst the mountain's fury. They were at her mercy, and she, with silent dignity, was saving their lives. The ascent was a slow torture, a frozen nightmare unfolding under the storm's merciless gaze. Theron, above, felt the makeshift rope burn his hands, his skin torn and bleeding under the relentless pressure of Kyle and the boy's weight. Every inch he pulled was a battle against gravity, against the cold that numbed his muscles, against the shame that still gnawed at him. He clenched his teeth, his eyes fixed on the crevice's darkness, where Ilara's voice was the only beacon. She seemed to feel no cold, no fatigue, no despair that consumed them. Her calm was a mystery, her strength an affront to Theron's wounded pride. Below, Kale struggled to keep Borin safe, the boy's body an inert weight tied to his own. His feet fumbled for purchase on the slippery rock ledges, while his already exhausted arms clung to the rope with the strength of despair. The cold was a constant presence, a deadly embrace that sucked the life from his limbs. Borin, semi-conscious, let out faint moans, each sound a dagger in Kyle's heart, driving him to continue, to ignore the searing pain in his own muscles. The darkness was almost total, broken only by the distant promise of the storm's light above, a constant reminder of the hell that awaited them. Ilara's voice, however, was the melody of survival. "More to the left, Kale. There's a foothold. Theron, pull more firmly but slowly. There's no rush, just the mountain and us." Her words were like a balm, an anchor in the storm of their fears. She guided them with astonishing precision, as if she had mapped every inch of that treacherous crevice in her mind. With each instruction, a new wave of admiration and guilt flooded Theron and Kale. How could they have scorned a woman with such wisdom, with such a deep connection to the very wild nature that now threatened them? Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity of effort and pain. The rope of cloaks and belts, wet and frozen, seemed increasingly fragile, its joins creaking under the tension. The wind howled above, a chorus of mocking spirits that seemed to celebrate their misery, but slowly, painfully, they ascended. The storm's faint light began to become a little more perceptible, a pale halo that promised the end of the abyss's darkness, but also the return to the uncontrolled fury of the elements. After what seemed a lifetime, Kale's head emerged from the crevice, followed by Borin's inert body. Theron, with one last superhuman effort, pulled them to the edge. Kale, trembling uncontrollably, collapsed in the snow, Borin still tied to him. The boy was pale, his lips blue, his eyes half closed and unfocused. He breathed, but it was a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Borin's life hung by a thread. A collective gasp of relief and despair escaped the guard's lips. They had succeeded, but at what cost? And now? Borin needed warmth, immediate help, but the storm still raged, and the cold was a hungry predator. Theron, exhausted, could barely hold his own weight, his hands raw, his body trembling with cold and exhaustion. Kyle was in a similar state, his mind in a fog of shock and relief. Ilara, however, didn't lose a second. Her eyes, which had guided Kyle in the darkness, now shone with renewed urgency. She knelt beside Borin, touching his icy face with unexpected tenderness. "He's alive," she murmured, more to herself than to them. "But not for long out here." She turned to the guards, her voice cutting through the wind's howl. "He needs warmth. Quickly, come with me." Without waiting for a response, Ilara stood and began to move, not back towards the village, but deeper into the mountains, in a direction that seemed even more desolate. The guards exchanged glances, confused and exhausted. Go deeper into the storm. It was madness, but the silent authority in Ilara's eyes was undeniable. There was no other option. They had trusted her to save Borin from the crevice. Now they would have to trust her to save him from the mountain. With difficulty, Theron and Kyle untied Borin, and Kale, despite his exhaustion, picked him up in his arms, the boy's body surprisingly light. With each step, snow lashed their faces. The wind tried to knock them down, but Ilara pressed on, a small and determined figure, as if she had an invisible map etched in her soul. They followed her blindly, their last strengths driven by the fragile hope that she knew what she was doing, that there was a refuge, a miracle amidst that white hell. Suddenly, Ilara stopped. They stood before a rock wall, seemingly impenetrable, but she reached out, feeling the surface. There was a subtle indentation, almost invisible beneath the accumulated snow. With a movement that seemed more instinctive than deliberate, she pushed. A segment of the rock, camouflaged by snow and ice, yielded, revealing a dark, narrow opening. From within, a breath of warm air, surprisingly soft and welcoming, escaped, carrying a faint aroma of damp earth and something more, something ancient and sacred. It was as if the mountain itself had opened its heart to them. The sanctuary. They had arrived. The warm breath that emerged from the crevice was not just a physical relief. It was a promise, a whisper of hope amidst the white hell. Theron and Cale, blinded by exhaustion and snow, could barely believe it. That air, so different from the mountain's icy bite, seemed to carry with it an aroma of damp earth, of ancient moss, and something more indescribable, something that spoke of centuries of silence and reverence. Ilara didn't hesitate. She turned to the opening, a small and resolute figure, and gestured, "Enter, quickly." Kyle, still holding Borin in his arms, was the first to squeeze through the narrow passage. The rough rocks scraped his clothes, but with each inch he advanced, the storm's cold lessened, replaced by a soft, enveloping warmth. Theron followed, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the crevice, his aching body protesting with every movement. The passage was short, a natural tunnel that curved gently downwards, and then, suddenly, opened up. What revealed itself before their eyes was something that defied all logic and experience they had of the mountain. It was not a frigid, damp cave, but a vast, vaulted space, bathed in a soft amber light that seemed to emanate from the rock walls themselves. The temperature was surprisingly pleasant, like a mild summer day, and the air was clean, light, with the same earthy, sacred aroma. Stalactites and stalagmites, sculpted by nature over eons, shone with a mysterious glow, and in some recesses, small springs of crystal-clear water bubbled softly, adding a tranquil murmur to the silence. In the center of the sanctuary, there was a rocky formation that looked like a natural altar, covered by vibrant emerald-green moss, which seemed to thrive in that unique environment. It was a place of untouched beauty, a secret kept by the mountain, and they, the arrogant village guards, were there, invited by the woman they had exiled. Ilara wasted no time with admiration. Her eyes, which had guided Kyle in the darkness, now swept the sanctuary with surprising familiarity. She pointed to a higher area, near one of the thermal springs that seemed to warm the environment. "There, put him there, Kyle, near the water. The heat will help him." Kyle, still in shock at the sight of the sanctuary, obeyed. Carefully, he laid Borin on a flat, moss-covered surface, which was surprisingly soft and warm to the touch. The boy's body was still icy, but the sanctuary's welcoming environment began to do its work. Borin's blue lips seemed to regain a faint color, and his breathing, though still weak, seemed a little more regular. Theron, stumbling inside, collapsed to his knees, not just from exhaustion, but from the magnitude of what he saw. Shame hit him like an avalanche. They had left Ilara to die in the cold, and she not only survived, but found, and was now saving them in a place that seemed straight out of a legend. The sanctuary was living proof of her wisdom, of her connection to the mountain, something they, in their arrogance, could never have understood. Ilara knelt beside Borin, her wrinkled hand touching the boy's forehead. "He needs more warmth and something to drink." She turned to Theron and Cale, who watched her with a mixture of reverence and guilt. "You are exhausted. Rest a little, but we need fire and warm water for him." Cale, despite his body protesting, felt a new wave of energy, driven by hope and the need for redemption. "Fire? How, Ilara? We have no firewood." Ilara smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, but was a glimpse of her inner strength. "This mountain provides. There are dry branches in the higher crevices where the wind deposited them, and the stones here are good for heating. Theron, can you go fetch some?" Theron, who could barely move his muscles, forced himself to his feet. "Yes, Ilara, I will go." His voice was hoarse, choked. The idea of going out into the storm again was terrifying, but the idea of failing Ilara, after everything, was even worse. He could not fail. Not now. As Theron dragged himself back to the opening, Kyle watched Ilara. She was taking off her own layers of clothing, not to warm herself, but to cover Borin, wrapping him carefully. Her movements were slow, deliberate, full of a tenderness Kyle never imagined the old widow could possess. She then turned to one of the springs, filling a small stone shell with warm water and carefully offering it to Borin's lips. "Little Borin," she whispered, her voice soft as the moss beneath their feet. "Drink, you need strength." Borin, with an almost imperceptible effort, swallowed some water. It was a weak sign, but a sign of life. Kyle felt a lump in his throat. The woman they had cast out, whom they had condemned to death, was the only one who knew how to save the life of the boy they had sworn to protect. The humiliation was deep, but gratitude, a strange and overwhelming warmth, began to melt the ice in his own heart. They were in the sanctuary, a place of miracles, and Ilara was its guardian. The storm outside still raged, but inside a new battle, the battle for their souls, was just beginning. The storm outside still raged, but inside a new battle, the battle for their souls, was just beginning. Theron, with Ilara's promise echoing in his ears, "This mountain provides," dragged himself back to the crevice. Every muscle screamed in protest, every joint felt frozen. The idea of returning to the White Fury was a visceral terror, but the shame of failing Ilara, of denying her the help she so generously offered, was an even heavier burden. He could not fail. Not now. He squeezed through the opening, and the outside world hit him like an icy fist. The wind, an invisible and furious predator, tried to tear him from the rock, whipping him with snowflakes sharp as glass. The darkness, which seemed to have been pushed back by the sanctuary's amber light, returned with overwhelming intensity, punctuated only by distant lightning flashes that momentarily revealed the desolate landscape. Theron clung to the rock, his raw fingers finding little purchase on the ice. The mountain, which once seemed indifferent, now showed itself hostile. He knew he needed to find dry branches, but where? Snow covered everything, a thick white shroud. He crawled, more by instinct than by sight, following Ilara's intuition, in the higher crevices where the wind deposited them. With each meter, the storm seemed to intensify, mocking his fragility. He remembered Borin, the pale and fragile boy, and the image of Ilara, small and determined, caring for him. That contrast between his past arrogance and his current helplessness was a blow more painful than the cold itself. Guilt, a slow poison, began to erode the last defenses of his pride. They had exiled her, condemned her to death, and now she was their only hope. He, the chief guard, the village protector, was at the mercy of an elderly widow they had scorned. The irony was brutal, the humiliation overwhelming. But amidst this avalanche of emotions, a new sensation began to emerge, a reluctant respect, a silent admiration for Ilara's resilience and wisdom. After what seemed an eternity of blindness and pain, his fingers touched something hard and irregular. A crevice in the rock, partially shielded from the strongest wind, revealed a tangle of dry, twisted, brittle branches, deposited there by the fury of countless past storms. The mountain indeed provided. With an agonizing effort, Theron began to break the branches, gathering them into a clumsy bundle. His hands were numb, his lungs burned, but he had what he needed. The return to the opening was equally torturous, but the sight of the crevice, the portal to warmth and hope, propelled him. Meanwhile, inside the sanctuary, Kyle watched Ilara. She was sitting beside Borin, her wrinkled, gentle hands massaging the boy's small feet, trying to restore circulation. She had taken off another layer of her own clothing, a faded wool shawl, and used it to cover Borin, adding to the pile of fabric that already enveloped him. Her movements were slow but precise, each touch imbued with a healing intention. She murmured soft, almost inaudible words, an ancient lullaby or a forgotten prayer, which seemed to calm not only Borin but Kyle himself. The boy, previously almost lifeless, now showed faint signs of improvement. His lips, though still pale, were no longer such a deep blue. His breathing, still weak, was more constant, a slight whisper in the sanctuary's silence. Ilara, with her innate wisdom, had found a smooth stone and heated it in one of the thermal springs, carefully placing it on Borin's chest, a gentle, constant warmth that seemed to infuse life into the small body. Kyle felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Gratitude was a surging river, but shame was a heavy rock in his chest. He had participated in Ilara's exile, had allowed injustice to happen, and now she, the victim of their cruelty, was saving the life of the boy he had sworn to protect. The image of Ilara, so small and fragile, yet with a strength and wisdom that surpassed all the men in the village, etched itself into his mind. He felt an ardent desire to help, to do something, anything, to lighten her burden, to redeem himself. "Ilara," Kyle murmured, his voice hoarse. "Is there anything else I can do?" Ilara raised her eyes, her grey, wise eyes meeting his. There was no judgment, only a deep understanding. "Observe, Kyle. Observe and learn. Care is not just strength, but patience and gentleness." She then indicated one of the thermal springs. "The warm water is a balm. Wet a cloth and wipe his face. Gently." Kyle obeyed, feeling strangely relieved to have a task, however small. He took a piece of fabric from his own tunic, wet it in the warm water, and with trembling hands wiped Borin's pale face. The touch was soft, almost reverent. It was the first time he had cared for someone with such delicacy, and the feeling of usefulness, of being part of the healing, was a balm for his own wounded soul. Suddenly, a shuffling noise came from the opening. Theron. He squeezed back into the sanctuary, stumbling, his body covered in snow and ice, his arms carrying a bundle of dry branches. He collapsed near the entrance, exhausted, but with an expression of grim triumph on his face. The branches fell to the rocky floor, producing a dry, satisfying sound. Ilara stood, her eyes shining with approval. "Well done, Theron. Now, the stones. We need some flat stones to heat." Theron, barely able to breathe, nodded. The battle for Borin's life continued, but the battle for the guard's souls, driven by Ilara's silent compassion, was gaining new ground. The sanctuary's amber light seemed to bless each of their efforts, transforming despair into a fragile but real hope. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak over Theron, every fiber of his being crying out for rest, but Ilara's voice, soft and firm, was a command that could not be ignored. "Well done, Theron. Now the stones. We need some flat stones to heat." He could barely breathe, but he nodded. The idea of moving another muscle was excruciating, but the shame of failing, of being useless before Ilara's wisdom and resilience, was an even greater burden. The sanctuary, though a refuge, was not a place of rest for him. It was a battlefield for Borin's life and, more subtly, for his own soul. Theron dragged himself, his eyes scanning the sanctuary's rocky floor. The walls were of raw stone, thermal springs bubbled in natural depressions. It didn't take long to find what Ilara was looking for: smooth, flat stones, some already warm from the proximity of the springs, others cold, waiting to be heated. Each movement was an agony, but the image of Borin, pale and fragile, propelled him. He collected them with difficulty, his numb fingers barely able to hold their weight. Meanwhile, Kale continued beside Borin, an unlikely guardian. He had finished wiping the boy's face, and now, following Ilara's silent example, he gently massaged Borin's arms and legs, trying to restore circulation. With each touch, he felt the boy's skin a little less cold, a faint sign that life was fighting to remain. Ilara watched, her grey eyes fixed on the boy, but her mind already planning the next step. When the Ron finally managed to gather a small pile of flat stones and deposited them near the dry branches, he collapsed again, gasping for breath. Ilara approached, her movements slow but full of purpose. She knelt, examining the branches and stones. "We need a spark," she murmured, more to herself than to them. Kyle, sensing the urgency, asked, "We have flint, Ilara." "I brought it with me." He pointed to the small leather pouch on his belt, an essential item for any guard on patrol. A flicker of something that looked like relief, almost a smile, crossed Ilara's lips. "Good, very good, Kyle." She took Kale's flint and steel, her wrinkled, experienced fingers handling them with surprising dexterity. She arranged a small nest of dry moss and bark fibers she had collected from a crevice in the sanctuary wall. The mountain indeed provided. With precise movements, she struck the steel against the flint. Sparks flew, some falling onto the moss nest. For a moment, nothing. Then a thin wisp of smoke, followed by a small flame, which Ilara gently blew upon. The flame, small at first, was a beacon against the darkness and cold that still permeated the sanctuary. She fed it with small twigs, carefully, until it became a constant, vibrant fire. The warmth spread, not just through the air, but through the guards' hearts. It was a warmth that promised life, that pushed away the shadows of despair. Ilara, with the same deliberate calm, began to place the flat stones around the fire, allowing the heat to slowly permeate them. "Kyle," Ilara said, her voice soft, "continue with Borin. Theron, you can help us build a small stone barrier around the fire to concentrate the heat and protect it from the wind entering through the crevice." Theron, though exhausted, felt a new wave of purpose. He stood, his muscles protesting, and began to stack larger stones, creating a protective semicircle around the fire. The work was arduous, but with each stone placed, he felt a fragment of his broken pride being rebuilt, not in arrogance, but in usefulness. He was working with Ilara, not against her. The fire crackled, its flames dancing and casting long shadows on the cave walls. The air in the sanctuary began to lose its biting cold, replaced by a comforting warmth. The stones, now hot to the touch, were carefully wrapped in pieces of fabric by Ilara and placed near Borin, adding more warmth to his small body. Kyle, watching Ilara, felt a deep admiration. She was not just a survivor, she was a master of the mountain, a guardian of ancient secrets. Her wisdom did not come from books or military training, but from an intimate connection with the earth and its elements. He found himself learning, absorbing every movement, every whisper. The humiliation was still there, an open wound, but it was being cauterized by the warmth of gratitude and the fire of redemption. Borin, wrapped in layers of clothing and warmed by the stones, let out a small, almost inaudible moan, but one that made the guards' hearts leap. His eyes, previously closed and sunken, opened slightly, blinking in the flickering firelight. Ilara leaned over him, offering the shell with warm water again. This time, Borin drank more easily, a clear sign of improvement. The storm outside still raged, a constant reminder of nature's fury, but inside the sanctuary, a small flame of hope burned brightly. Borin's life was far from safe, and the guard's journey to redemption was just beginning. But for the first time in days, there was warmth, there was light, and there was the promise of a new dawn, guided by the woman they had tried to silence. The mountain which had chastised them now offered its gifts through Ilara's wise hands. The small flame, fed with care and purpose, danced in the heart of the sanctuary, casting living shadows on the rocky walls. The warmth emanating from it was more than physical. It was a promise, a balm for souls chastised by the storm's fury and the shame of their own mistakes. Borin, the little warrior fighting against the grip of the cold, reacted to every touch. To every breath of warmth, Ilara and the guards offered him. His eyes, previously just pale slits, now opened a little wider, revealing a cloudy blue that blinked in the flickering light. A deeper sigh escaped his lips, and a tremor ran through his body, no longer from cold, but from a gradual awakening. Ilara, with her ancestral wisdom, noticed the change. She leaned in, her snow-white hair falling gently over the boy's face. "Borin," she whispered, her voice soft as the moss that lined the cave's crevices. "You are with us, little one. You are safe." The boy moaned again, a fragile sound, but undeniably present. His small fingers moved, trying to grasp the shawl covering him. Kyle, kneeling beside Ilara, felt a lump in his throat. It was a miracle. A life being pulled back from the abyss, all by the hands of the woman they had abandoned. Gratitude was an almost unbearable weight, but it was a weight he was willing to carry. Ilara offered the shell with warm water again. This time Borin not only drank, but swallowed more strongly, a clear sign that life was returning. His eyes fixed on Ilara's for a brief moment, a glimpse of recognition, before closing again into a more peaceful sleep. Danger still lurked, but the immediate battle for the boy's survival seemed to be won. Theron, who had finished building the small stone barrier around the fire, watched the scene in silence. Exhaustion still dominated him, but the sight of Borin reacting, of Ilara with her unshakable calm, infused him with an energy he didn't know he possessed. He had been a fool, an arrogant man, blinded by authority and pride. Now he saw true strength, not in sword or armor, but in compassion and resilience. Shame was a bitter poison, but the possibility of redemption, of learning, was a powerful antidote. The fire crackled, and the smell of smoke and damp earth filled the air. The storm outside continued to rage, a constant reminder of their fragile existence. But inside the sanctuary there was warmth, there was light, and there was new hope. Ilara, satisfied with Borin's improvement, turned to the guards. Her grey eyes, which had seen so many seasons and so much sorrow, now shone with a quiet determination. "We are not safe yet," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The storm could last for days. We need more than warmth. We need sustenance." Kale and Theron exchanged glances. They had brought some dry rations, but they were few and intended for a short patrol, not a prolonged siege. Food was scarce, and water, though abundant in the thermal springs, would not provide the necessary energy. "Our provisions are limited, Ilara," Kyle admitted, his voice laden with concern. "We have a little dried meat and some hard biscuits, but they won't last long for the three of us, much less for Borin when he can eat." Ilara nodded, her eyes scanning the cave walls, as if seeking answers from the rocks themselves. "The mountain provides," she murmured, a phrase Kyle had heard before, but which now resonated with an entirely new meaning. "But one must know where to look, and one must have courage." She stood, her movements slow but full of purpose. "There is more to this sanctuary than just the springs. There are crevices and niches that hold secrets. Mushrooms, edible roots, perhaps even some herbs that can strengthen Borin. But the darkness is deep, and the passages can be treacherous." Theron, feeling a new wave of usefulness, stood up. "I will go, Ilara. I'm the strongest. I can search." Kyle, not wanting to be left behind, added, "Me too. I know the mountain caves, though not these in particular. I can help map them." Ilara watched them, a glint of approval in her eyes. Arrogance had been replaced by humility, reluctance by readiness. It was progress, a sign that the seed of compassion had taken root. "Good," she said, "but with caution. Take a torch and a bag. And remember, do not take anything that is not essential. The mountain gives, but it also demands respect." She indicated a narrow crevice in the wall opposite the main entrance, almost imperceptible in the dim light. "Start there. There's a small tunnel that leads to a wider chamber. Look for glowing mosses and broad-leafed plants. And be alert for any unusual sounds. The mountain is not alone. Kyle and Theron took their torches, lighting them from the sacred fire. The flickering light danced on the walls, revealing the sanctuary's complexity. They exchanged glances, a new camaraderie born from shared danger and mutual responsibility. The journey to redemption was not just about surviving the storm, but about rediscovering their humanity. As they prepared to enter the unknown depths of the sanctuary, Elara turned back to Borin, her face illuminated by the fire's glow. The boy's life was the beacon that guided them, and the old widow's wisdom was the compass that kept them on track. The storm outside might rage, but within, a new flame of hope and purpose had been kindled, stronger and warmer than any cold the mountain could offer. The battle for Borin's life was at a turning point, but the guard's journey, driven by Elara's silent compassion, was only beginning to reveal its true challenges. The flickering light of the torches danced on the rocky walls, casting elongated, distorted shadows that seemed to come alive. Kyle and Theron, with empty bags slung over their shoulders and determination etched on their faces, stood at the mouth of the narrow crevice, a portal to the unknown. The warmth of the sacred fire, which once seemed an absolute refuge, was now a reminder of the cold and darkness that awaited them. Elara approached, her grey eyes fixed on them, a mixture of concern and trust. "Remember," she said, her voice a whisper that seemed to echo the mountain itself, "the mountain gives, but it also demands respect. Do not take anything that is not essential, and be alert for any unusual sounds. The mountain is not alone." Elara's last sentence hung in the air, a shiver running down the two guards' spines. They exchanged glances, their newfound camaraderie, an anchor against the fear that was beginning to settle in. Kyle, with a nod, was the first to squeeze through the crevice, his torch held high. Theron followed him, the weight of responsibility and the promise of redemption propelling him forward. The tunnel was damp and tight, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and minerals. The torch's light barely managed to push back the darkness that seemed to close in on them. Each step echoed, amplified by the oppressive silence, and the sounds of the storm outside became a distant murmur, almost forgotten in the immensity of the rock. Kyle felt his heart pound in his chest, a mixture of claustrophobia and apprehension. He, the proud guard who patrolled the open fields, now crawled through a hole in the earth, searching for sustenance. The irony was bitter, but Borin's need was a fire stronger than any pride. After the narrow tunnel, they emerged into a wider but no less dark chamber. Kyle's torch revealed a high, uneven ceiling with pointed stalactites hanging like the teeth of a sleeping monster. Moisture dripped down the walls, forming small puddles on the rocky floor. It was then that Theron pointed, his voice a little hoarse. "Look, Kyle, glowing mosses, just as Elara described." Indeed, in niches and crevices of the wall, small clusters of moss emitted an ethereal, greenish glow, a ghostly light that seemed to pulse. Carefully, Kyle approached, remembering Elara's instructions. "They're edible," he murmured, more to himself than to Theron. "Rich in nutrients," the ancients say. They began to harvest, filling their bags with the mosses and some pale roots they found growing among the rocks. The work was slow and meticulous, and with each piece collected, a thread of hope ignited within them. But the chamber was not empty. A subtle sound, a soft dragging, broke the silence. Kale and Theron froze, their torches raised, their eyes sweeping the darkness. The sound seemed to come from a passage further ahead, a crevice even darker than the one they had crossed. It was a sound that didn't seem natural, not the drip of water or the whisper of wind. It was something alive. "What was that?" Theron whispered, his hand instinctively on his sword hilt, though he knew it would be useless in such a confined space. I don't know, Kale replied. His voice tense. Ilara said to be alert. The mountain is not alone. He took a cautious step towards the crevice, the torchlight flickering, revealing only more darkness. The sound repeated, closer now, a dry rustling, like leaves being dragged, or perhaps scales. A chill ran through Kyle. He had faced bandits, forest beasts, but the mountain's darkness and unknown were a different threat, one that stirred primal fears. He thought of Borin, the small body fighting for life, and the silent promise he had made to himself to protect him. This gave him courage. Let's go back, Theron said, his voice a little firmer now. We have enough for Borin and for us for a while. We don't need to risk more. He was right. Prudence was the new wisdom. But before they could turn, a shadow moved in the crevice. It wasn't large, but it was fast. Something crawled out, a pale, elongated creature, with eyes that reflected the torchlight like cold gems. It wasn't a beast of teeth and claws, but a being from the depths, adapted to darkness, with a segmented body and thin appendages that dragged over the rocks. It looked like a giant centipede, but with a cold intelligence in its eyes. Kyle and Theron instinctively retreated, their swords still sheathed, for they knew the creature was faster than them. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the chamber. The creature didn't attack, but writhed, blocking the passage to the crevice that led deeper. It seemed to be guarding something or just curious. Don't provoke it, Kyle whispered, remembering Ilara's words about respect. It's in its domain. The creature hissed, a damp, chilling sound, and its eyes fixed on them. It was a warning, a boundary. They had harvested what the mountain offered, but they should not go beyond. The lesson was clear. With their bags partially filled, they decided it was time to return. The sight of the creature, though not aggressive, was a vivid reminder of the fragility of their existence and the vast, mysterious life the mountain harbored. They retreated slowly, keeping the torch pointed at the creature, which watched them with unsettling stillness. The journey back through the narrow tunnel seemed longer and darker. The silence, once oppressive, now seemed filled with the memory of the creature's hiss. When they finally emerged back into the main sanctuary, the warmth of the sacred fire and the presence of Ilara and Borin were a balm for their troubled souls. Ilara watched them, her grey eyes reading the tension on their faces. "You found something more than mosses, didn't you?" she asked, her voice calm but perceptive. Kyle nodded, cold sweat still on his forehead. "The mountain is not alone. Ilara, you were right." He placed the bag of edible mosses and roots on the ground, his gratitude for her wisdom deeper than ever. Borin, wrapped in blankets, let out a small moan, his blue eyes opening slightly. Ilara leaned over him, a soft smile on her lips. The boy's life was the beacon, and their journey, driven by compassion and Ilara's ancestral wisdom, was only beginning to reveal its true challenges. The storm outside still raged, but inside the sanctuary, the flame of hope, fed by mosses and roots harvested in the darkness, burned brighter than ever. The silence that followed was filled only by the crackling of the sacred fire and the distant howl of the wind outside. Kyle, still a little shaken by the experience, began to describe the creature. It wasn't a beast like those we know, Ilara. It had no teeth or claws to attack. It was pale and elongated, with many segments and eyes that glowed in the darkness. It seemed to watch us, to warn us. It blocked a passage as if saying, "No further than this." Theron, still with his hand on his sword hilt, added, "It was terrifying, Ilara, not for its brute strength, but for its presence, for the way it moved, as if it were part of the rock itself." Ilara listened carefully, a faint smile appearing on her wrinkled lips. "The mountain has its own guardians, my dears. Creatures that inhabit the depths and protect its secrets. They are not malicious, just territorial. They teach respect. You did well not to provoke it. The mountain gives, but it also demands that we know our limits. Understanding shone in the guard's eyes. It was not a threat to be fought, but a lesson to be learned. The arrogance of before, which would have made them attack anything unknown, had been replaced by a forced but now genuine humility. They had found what they needed, and the mountain had shown them that there was much more to learn than just the art of the sword. Ilara knelt beside the bag, taking a handful of the glowing mosses and some of the pale roots. "This will be good for Borin," she murmured, her fingers agile and experienced. Rich in life, even in darkness, the mountain always provides. With precise movements, she picked up a smooth stone and a stone bowl she had found in a sanctuary niche. She began to crush the mosses and roots, adding a little warm water from the sacred springs. The earthy, fresh scent filled the air, an aroma of life and healing that contrasted with the stench of fear and sickness that had previously hung over Borin. The resulting paste was pale green and thick, with small pieces of the roots. "We need him to eat," Ilara said, turning to Kale and Theron. "It's the only way to strengthen his body and ward off the fever." The guards' hearts pounded in their chests. It was a moment of anguish and hope, a silent battle against death that seemed so near. Each second felt like an eternity as they watched. Borin, with an almost imperceptible sigh, swallowed. Once, twice, 3 times, the paste went down his throat. Ilara continued patiently, offering small portions. The boy swallowed, reflexively like a hungry pup. With each portion, a small flame of hope lit up in Kale and Theron's eyes. They had faced enemies in battle, but helplessness before a child's illness was a much greater challenge. After a few minutes, Borin stopped swallowing. His eyes closed again, but this time there was a subtle difference. A faint color began to return to his pale cheeks, and his breathing, though still weak, seemed a little more regular. The cold sweat on his forehead had diminished. Ilara touched the boy's forehead with her palm, a gesture of affection and assessment. "The fever is subsiding," she whispered, a hint of relief in her voice. "It's not gone, but it's retreating. The mountain is helping." Kyle and Theron exchanged a look, a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. The journey to redemption was not just about surviving the storm, but about rediscovering their humanity, and Borin was the catalyst for this transformation. They had harvested mosses in the darkness, faced an ancestral guardian, and now a boy's life was beginning to revive, nourished by the wisdom of a woman they had scorned. The storm outside still raged, a constant reminder of nature's fury, but inside the sanctuary a new flame of hope and purpose had been kindled, stronger and warmer than any cold the mountain could offer. The battle for Borin's life was at a turning point, but the guard's journey, driven by Ilara's silent compassion, was only beginning to reveal its true challenges. They had taken the first step, but they knew that full recovery would be long and would require more than just mosses. It would require faith, patience, and the continued guidance of the widow who had become their compass. Borin's breathing, previously a faint and irregular thread, now stabilized into a softer rhythm, a whisper of life that seemed to echo in the sanctuary's reverent silence. The fever, though still present, had relinquished its cruelest grip, and the deadly pallor of his cheeks gave way to a fragile rosy hue. Ilara, with the wisdom of one who had witnessed the tenuous line between life and death, did not openly celebrate, but her grey eyes shone with contained hope. She knew the battle was far from won, but the first and most critical step had been taken. Kyle and Theron watched, their own breaths held, each small sign of improvement in the boy, a balm for their tormented souls. The sight of Borin swallowing the paste of mosses and roots, the decrease in fever, was a victory that surpassed any battle they had ever fought. The arrogance and disdain they once felt for Ilara had been completely swept away by overwhelming gratitude. She was no longer the old, outcast widow. She was the guardian of life, the compass in their darkness. "He is stronger," Ilara whispered, her voice hoarse but firm as she touched the boy's forehead again. "But he still needs more. The mosses and roots are medicine, but they are not food. His body is weak. It needs substance to rebuild itself." The guards' hearts tightened. The storm outside continued to howl, a constant reminder that the outside world was an insurmountable danger. They were trapped, and the supplies they had brought were scarce. "What does he need, Ilara?" Kyle asked, his voice filled with a new urgency. "Tell us! We will do whatever it takes." Ilara turned to them, her eyes fixed, assessing the sincerity in their words. "The mountain offers more, but it demands patience and respect. There is a deeper chamber beyond the one you visited. There, in the hottest springs, grow fungi that feed on steam and rock. They are rich in nutrients, more than anything we have ever seen. But the passage is narrow, and the heat is intense, and the guardian, he is not the only being that inhabits the depths." A chill ran down Kyle and Theron's spines. The image of the pale, segmented creature was still vivid in their minds. Now Ilara spoke of other dangers, of suffocating heat and an even more treacherous passage. But Borin's life was at stake. There was no hesitation. "We will go," Theron declared, his hand on his sword hilt, an instinctive gesture but now tempered by humility. "Show us the way." Ilara nodded, a faint smile of approval on her lips. "Wisdom is not just in the strength of the sword, but in the courage of the heart. Follow me, but this time take only the essentials, and prepare for the heat." She stood, picked up a new torch and a small empty leather bag. The sacred fire flickered, casting dancing shadows on the sanctuary walls, as if the rocks themselves were watching their journey. Borin, now in a more peaceful sleep, seemed a small beacon of hope amidst the impending darkness. The passage to the new chamber was, indeed, narrower and steeper than the previous one. The air grew denser and more humid with each step, and the smell of sulfur and hot minerals began to fill their lungs. Beads of sweat ran down Kyle and Theron's faces, and their heavy guard clothes felt like an unbearable burden. "The heat is intense here," Ilara warned, her voice almost inaudible over the muffled hum that seemed to come from the depths. "It is the mountain's breath. Hold firm." They crawled through a crevice that barely allowed a man to pass, their armor scraping against the rough rocks. Ilara's torch barely illuminated the way, revealing only moisture dripping down the walls and the strange glow of crystals embedded in the rock. The humming sound grew louder, and now they could distinguish a soft bubbling, like a boiling pot. The passage opened into a smaller but much hotter chamber. The air was so dense it felt suffocating. In the center, a pool of water bubbled and steamed, illuminated by a ghostly greenish glow that came from below. It was an underground thermal spring, and on the damp rocks around it grew the fungi Ilara had described. They were pale, almost translucent, with a soft glow that seemed to pulse, but they were not alone. Near the spring, coiled in a sticky web cocoon, was a different creature. Not the giant centipede, but something more arachnid, with 8 gleaming eyes and long, thin legs that moved with disturbing agility. It was larger than any spider Kale or Theron had ever seen, and its dark, segmented body seemed to absorb the little ambient light. It didn't move, but its eyes fixed on them with a cold, calculating intelligence. It was the guardian of that place, and its presence was a clear warning. "Do not look it directly in the eyes," Ilara whispered, her voice tense. "It senses intent. Just take what we need and leave, quickly." Kale and Theron felt cold sweat run down their backs, mixing with the suffocating heat of the chamber. The tension was palpable, every muscle in their bodies on high alert. Borin's life depended on this, But the danger there was undeniable, primal. The mountain in its generosity also demanded a price, and they were about to pay it. The journey to redemption, they realized, was an endless series of tests, each more challenging than the last, and the widow, with her unshakable calm, was the only one who could guide them through it. Time was running out, and the spider watched. The chamber pulsed with a humid, suffocating heat, the air dense with the smell of sulfur and the promise of life and death. Kyle and Theron felt sweat run down their foreheads, mixing with the cold of apprehension. The giant spider, with its 8 gleaming eyes and long, thin legs, was a sight of primal terror, a silent and relentless guardian. Its eyes were not empty. They carried a cold, calculating intelligence that penetrated the soul. "Do not look it directly in the eyes," Elara whispered again, her voice a thin thread, but laden with authority. "It senses intent. Just take what we need and leave. Quickly." Kyle was the first to move, a hesitant but determined step. His eyes, trained for battle, struggled not to fix on the creature, but on the pale, translucent fungi growing on the damp rocks around the bubbling spring. The soft glow of the fungi seemed both an invitation and a warning. Theron, his sword still in its sheath, positioned himself slightly behind Kyle, his hand trembling faintly, ready for any movement. The spider did not move. Its eyes, however, followed Kyle's every movement, as if reading his deepest thoughts. It was a dance of intentions, a silent ballet between desperate need and ancestral vigilance. Kyle knelt, the heat of the rock burning his knees through his tunic. He slowly reached out, his fingers touching the fungi that seemed to pulse with a light of their own. The creature let out a low, almost inaudible hiss that made the air vibrate. One of its front legs moved, scraping on the rock with a dry, chilling sound. It was not an attack, but a warning, a display of power. Kyle froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the spider's gaze weighing on him, an invisible pressure that threatened to crush him. Elara, with a calm that defied the situation, made a small sound with her throat, a soft croak. The spider turned 2 of its eyes to her for a brief instant and then refocused on Kyle. It was as if Elara was communicating, appeasing the beast, or perhaps just reminding them of the urgency. With a renewed breath, Kyle reached out again, this time more quickly, but still with the precision of a hunter. He plucked a handful of the fungi, feeling their soft, damp texture. The pale glow seemed to intensify in his hands. He quickly placed them in the leather bag Elara had brought, his movements hurried but controlled. The spider remained motionless, watching. Kyle took another handful and then another until the bag was reasonably full. Every second was an eternity of tension. Finally, with the bag secure, Kyle retreated slowly, without turning his back on the creature. Theron covered him, his eyes fixed on the spider, ready for any eventuality. "Now," Elara whispered, "leave, without haste, but without hesitation." They crawled back through the narrow crevice, the heat gradually diminishing, but the sweat and fear persisting. Only when they emerged into the sanctuary's main chamber, where the sacred fire flickered and Borin slept, did Kyle and Theron allow themselves to breathe deeply. They were exhausted, their bodies heavy, and their minds overwhelmed, but the leather bag in their hands was proof of their courage and their newfound faith. Elara took the bag, her agile fingers removing the pale fungi. She placed them in the stone bowl, adding a little warm water from the springs and crushing them with the smooth stone. The scent was now sweeter, less earthy than the mosses, with an almost floral hint. The resulting paste was creamier, a milky white with a subtle glow. "This is the nourishment he needs," Elara said, her voice soft but full of conviction. "The mountain has given us its deepest strength." With the same delicacy as before, she took a piece of clean cloth and dipped it in the paste. Borin, still weak, opened his eyes slightly when the cloth touched his lips. This time, his blue eyes seemed to have a little more focus, a spark of recognition. He swallowed, not with the reflex of a pup, but with a faint awareness. Ilara continued patiently, offering small portions. Each swallow from Borin was a balm for the guard's souls. The rosy color in his cheeks deepened, and his breathing became stronger, more regular. The cold sweat disappeared completely, replaced by a more natural warmth. After a few minutes, Borin let out a deep sigh, a sound of relief that filled the sanctuary. He opened his eyes completely, and this time they were clear, fixing on Ilara, then on Kyle and Theron. A small smile, fragile as a newborn flower, curved his lips. "Mother," he whispered, his voice hoarse but audible. Kyle and Theron's hearts tightened. The word, spoken to Ilara, was an acknowledgement of the life she had given him. The widow touched the boy's forehead, her grey eyes moist. "You are safe now, my little one. The mountain has embraced you." Outside, the storm's howl, which had been a constant threat, began to diminish. The strong winds transformed into gentle breezes, and the sound of falling snow lessened to a whisper. Nature's fury seemed to calm in sync with Borin's recovery, as if the mountain itself had witnessed the redemption and offered its peace. Kale and Theron fell to their knees before Ilara, not in submission, but in profound humility and gratitude. Words failed them, but their gazes said everything. The arrogance, the disdain, the cruelty that had driven them had been washed away by the storm and the widow's wisdom. They had witnessed true sanctity, not in temples of stone, but in the heart of a woman and the generosity of the mountain. "Ilara," Kyle finally managed to say, his voice choked with emotion. We were blind. Forgive us. You saved Borin's life. You saved our souls." Theron, beside him, nodded vigorously, tears streaming down his face. "We scorned you. We cast you out, and you gave us life. There is not enough forgiveness for our cruelty." Ilara looked at them, her grey eyes deep and wise. She had sought no revenge, not even recognition. Her motivation was life, the connection to the mountain, and innate compassion. "The mountain holds no grudges," she said softly. "It merely teaches, and you have learned. True strength is not in dominating, but in serving. True wisdom is not in casting out, but in welcoming." She stood, her eyes fixed on the sacred fire's glow. "The storm is passing. The way back to the village will be open soon. What will you do now, guards? Will you return to your old ways, or will you carry the wisdom you found here?" Kyle and Theron exchanged glances, a new determination in their eyes. The village had sent them to cast out Ilara, but they would return as transformed men, with a new mission. They had witnessed true sanctity, not in stone temples, but in the heart of a woman and the generosity of the mountain. "We will take you back, Ilara," Kyle declared, his voice firm and full of purpose. "Not as an outcast, but as the guardian. The village needs to learn what we have learned. It needs your wisdom, and we will be your protectors, not your tormentors." Ilara smiled, a rare and radiant smile that lit up her wrinkled face. The flame in the sacred sanctuary seemed to dance more intensely, and the air filled with a profound peace. The elderly widow, cast out and scorned, had found her home and purpose in the mountains, and in doing so had rescued not only a life, but the soul of an entire village, teaching that true redemption is born of humility and compassion, stronger than any storm or prejudice. The journey had ended, but the true story of Ilara and the village was only just beginning to be written in the sacred rocks of the mountain.